Foster Hirsch's 2023 book, Hollywood and the Movies of the 50s, includes a fascinating chapter on the race films of the era. The flawed but earnest attempts of mid-century American cinema to address racial identity and racism as a social ill. Hirsch's perspective is critical yet sympathetic, acknowledging the problematic qualities of the 50s race films, from the reliance on ethnic stereotypes to the casting of white actors in non-white roles, but ultimately applauds the films for their bravery in addressing race at all, finding value in their imperfect stumbles. The chapter is an argument in favor of reckoning with outdated media, and fittingly concludes with an impassioned plea for openness when considering classic cinema. I would end with this caveat, however. There is no necessary correspondence between a film's political correctness scorecard and its artistic achievement. A movie that satisfies all the current standards of identity politics might be a dud, while one that strays from prevailing orthodoxy might be a compelling work of art. And of course, it can work the other way around as well. Must we be in complete ideological agreement with a film in order to enjoy it or to sanction it? As political discourse in America has become increasingly polarized, with each side demonizing the other, and with the epithet of racist being hurled by the left with the same frequency that the right employed communist in the blacklist era, it seems to me that we who love movies from the past and are dedicated to protecting their legacy must approach them with minds and hearts that are as open as possible. Some of my younger colleagues scorn the rampant representational toxicity in studio-era Hollywood films. Yes, there are many examples, of course, and they should be called out. But to reframe film history by relentlessly attacking its racial and sexual misdemeanors, its blind spots, is a sure route to being a biased and narrow-minded historian, to not being a historian at all, but rather a punishing, holier-than-thou activist with an agenda. There are a couple of potential red flags in this passage. Hirsch's equation of the modern left's use of racist as a pejorative to the right's use of communist during the blacklist is especially eyebrow-raising. The blacklist wasn't like calling people names. It was a response to an organized political movement where suspected communists were made to testify on their political affiliations and allegiance to the United States in hearings that were essentially public trials. Film industry personnel who refused to testify, many citing the invasion of civil liberties and personal freedoms, were barred from employment by the major film studios, devastating their professional and personal lives. Some blacklisted artists did eventually recover their careers, but many did not. Hirsch knows this. It's one thing to criticize the left for their overwillingness to accuse opponents of racism, but to equate that overwillingness with the institutional injustices of the blacklist is disingenuous. I'm also not convinced that protecting the legacy of movies from the past is the optimal position, as it seemingly assumes an adversarial relationship to criticism and a servitude to classic cinema. Past media should certainly be preserved and studied, and quite often it will also be enjoyed, but should protection be a default goal? Ultimately, though, what struck me most about this passage are not its red flags, but that I agree with the overall sentiment. I do think it's a mistake to conflate ideology and artistic achievement. Those categories are not mutually exclusive. What a film believes and how it expresses those beliefs are certainly linked to its artistry, but they're also not synonymous. Study of film history should call out representational toxicity, but media engagement which begins and ends with calling out the problematic qualities of a text is counterproductive. What does it benefit us, critically, to simply chastise the past for its failings? Surely, it's more beneficial to place those failings in their historical context, and consider the progressive strides and precedents alongside the regressive lapses. That is the difference between a study of history rooted in inquiry and investigation, and one rooted in reduction, in writing off the past for its problematic qualities rather than learning from them. Ironically, though, Just as I found myself agreeing with Hirsch, my comment section was flooding with anger over my discussion of race and gender in the AFI Top 100 list, essentially accusing me of being the very same holier-than-thou activist with an agenda Hirsch bemoaned. I must say, I was a little surprised with the response, given, for all my criticisms, I'm pretty unambiguously pro-list. I even made a case for why a racist movie like The Jazz Singer should be included among the AFI's pantheon given its historical significance, which is especially bold of me given I don't even like The Jazz Singer. You could dismiss these comments as your typical anti-woke bellyaching, and you wouldn't be wrong, but both these complaints and Hirsch's far more thoughtful passage refer to the same question. How do we deal with old movies? It's a legitimate question. I think every classic movie fan can relate to the experience of getting swept up in an old film only to be suddenly pulled out by some casual expression of bigotry. Maybe it's a slur, maybe it's a visual stereotype, or maybe it's something more nebulous. Nothing overtly offensive is said or shown, but an underlying regressive attitude is detected beneath the surface. These experiences absolutely exist. But at the same time, the dichotomy of old movies regressive and bad, new movies progressive and good, is a fallacy. You do not need to look very far back to find examples of bigotry in mainstream cinema.
Paging Dr.
It was only a little over a decade ago that ableist and homophobic slurs were standard practice in Hollywood comedies. You can certainly criticize the race films of the 50s and 60s for examining racism through an individualist lens rather than a sociological one, for their emphasis on idealized black men, primarily designed to comfort white liberals, and for the predominance of narratives where a black man and a white racist learn to respect each other. And you can make those exact same critiques of 2018 Best Picture winner Green Book, a movie where institutional racism is broached but ultimately sidestepped for the interpersonal conflict between an idealized black man and a white racist who learn to be friends. 50 years after the height of Sidney Poitier's stardom, and Hollywood is still rewarding the same style of paternalizing and unchallenging race films. In fact, Green Book represents a massive step backwards from the days of Poitier. The narrative arc of In the Heat of the Night may rest on the burgeoning friendship between Poitier's detective Tibbs and racist police chief Bill Gillespie, but the film does not soft-pedal Gillespie's personality. He is unambiguously a bigot, and more generally, a lonely, bitter, and hateful person. Tony Lip, meanwhile, is a real blue-collar guy, with a beautiful wife, a sense of humor, and an easygoing charisma. He's pretty charming, apart from, the racism. The film certainly sees Tony's racism as bad, but it's also a character flaw he can get over by befriending a black guy. And just as Dr. Shirley teaches a white guy not to be so prejudiced, Tony teaches Dr. Shirley to let his hair down a bit and not be such a snob. So they both learn something, and the film extrapolates this condescending message to a broader point about racial reconciliation, reflected in Dr. Shirley no longer being harassed by the police when he leaves the South and returns to New York, where the good white people are. In the Heat of the Night also ends in a racial reconciliation, but it's entirely interpersonal, and the film does not extend two men overcoming their differences to a broader cultural healing. Paternalistic and condescending is one thing, but what about an actively hateful movie? Surely those are safely consigned to the long-distant past, right? Not so. Let's talk about Ace Ventura. If you haven't seen the film in a while, you might be surprised that I'd take such umbrage with the movie where Jim Carrey talks out of his butt, but consider how the crux of the climax is the sexual humiliation and public mockery of a trans woman, whose mere existence is treated as a disgusting punchline. It's frankly shocking. Even if you look past the transphobia, which admittedly is a large feat, the joke is still predicated on the film's comedic hero forcibly stripping someone half naked and exposing their genitals, which I'm pretty sure is a crime. Funny stuff. Now, at 30 years old, Ace Ventura is not exactly a new movie, But as someone born in 1994, I refuse to accept that the film is old. The 90s weren't that long ago. The film is still popular, its stars still relevant to new generations through the enduring popularity of Friends or Carrey's late career work in the Sonic movies. The 90s were a different time, sure, but it's not like more nuanced or empathetic portraits of trans people in movies didn't exist. They did, even in mainstream cinema. Just 2 years before Ace Ventura, The Crying Game would feature a similar trans panic twist, but it was neither a punchline nor an endpoint. The film actually examines its protagonist's discomfort with trans bodies, who apologizes for how he treated a trans woman, the two even developing a sensitive relationship in the film's second half. Even a more shameless film like 1980's Dressed to Kill, which indulges in the trans person as devious sex criminal and murderer stereotype, still lacks the judgment and meanness evident in Ace Ventura. Point being, a film being newer is no guarantee that its content is more progressive. And the most vivid example of this can be found in the James Bond franchise, which has a long history of sexism, along with the occasional bouts of racism, imperialism, and homophobia. Naturally, it is my favorite film franchise of all time.
I have no objections.
A cornerstone of the series has always been Bond's sexual desire. The films offer a parade of sexy women with silly, innuendo-laden names, ogled by the camera and lusted for by Bond, whose conquests of these women reflect his own strength and power. And since at least the late 60s, the filmmakers have been trying to complicate the image of the Bond girl. From casting more accomplished actresses rather than models who had a tenuous grasp of English, to responding to the gains of second-wave feminism with women who approached equal partner to Bond rather than subservient damsel, to de-emphasizing the fetishization of women's bodies, the series has tried to keep up with the times.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
Newest Bond girl Madeleine Swann is emblematic of that shift. She's still a hot woman, every Bond girl is, but she doesn't have a sexy pun for a name and doesn't spend her screen time in skimpy outfits while the camera fixates on individual body parts. She is a damsel who needs to be saved by Bond, but she's also smart, an accomplished doctor and independent woman, played by acclaimed actress Léa Seydoux. Madeleine Swann is the modern, progressive 007 leading lady. Or at least she is on paper. Look a bit deeper, however, and the cracks start to appear. I called the character smart, but how do we know that? She doesn't say anything particularly witty or perceptive, she doesn't offer any wisdom or new ideas, and only once across 2 films does Madeleine draw on her intelligence to outsmart a bad guy. Instead, we know she's smart because she's a doctor, and doctors are smart. It's essentially a cheat from the filmmakers, who want a smart leading lady but don't want to put in the work to actually make one. Agent XXX or Pussy Galore might have stupid names, but they read as smarter and more capable in their films because they actually get one over on Bond. Madeleine doesn't get that kind of agency. James literally abandons her while she is pregnant with his child, and when they reunite years later, she barely seems mad.
I understand you're not built to trust people.
I wanted to.
It's hard to imagine Tracy or Isabella putting up with that. Despite casting a top-tier talent in the role, Madeleine is boring. She doesn't have much in the way of personality or desire, and mostly serves a narrative function. Léa Seydoux is probably a better actress than, Carey Lowell, but you wouldn't know that from their Bond movies, since Lowell actually gets to play a character with some fire. Madeleine appears a more progressive version of the Bond girl archetype on the surface, but fundamentally, very little has changed. Madeleine may not be ogled by the camera, but she is still an ornament for Bond. Someone to love him, to provide him a family, to look good next to him on a poster. But her own character is unimportant. That's not to say the older Bonds are actually more feminist than the new ones, or exonerate the older films of their misogyny, but to indicate that the straight line of progress is an illusion. Meanwhile, plenty of older films will prove themselves far more progressive than you'd expect, at times even by modern standards. The last decade has seen increasing criticism of the practice of casting able-bodied actors as disabled characters. Here's a movie from 1946 where a disabled war veteran is played by real-life amputee Harold Russell. Mental health resources and advocacy have become more abundant, more accessible, and more widely respected. Here's a movie from 1952 where a woman's mental health struggles are treated with empathy and care. Sex work remains incredibly stigmatized and maligned. Here's a movie from 1933 where the protagonist, a coded sex worker, is far and away the most respected person on screen, both by the filmmakers and within the diegesis.
Right away, Lou.
And a movie doesn't have to be perfect to be socially admirable. 1950's No Way Out stars Poitier as the first black doctor in his hospital. The film is at least partially responsible for creating the Sidney Poitier screen persona, a brilliant and exceptional black man who has risen to the top of his profession through skill, passion, and good manners. That persona would eventually become a limitation. Poitier pressured, as the only black megastar in the movies, not to take parts that would reflect poorly on black people, and continuously taking films designed around comforting white viewers. But there's also a lot of value in such a capable black hero existing on the screen. And despite the way Poitier's characters have historically been criticized for catering to white audiences, No Way Out takes time to express the anger and indignity Dr. Brooks feels as a black man oath-bound to help a vile racist.
Don't cry, white boy. You're gonna live.
This complexity speaks to the fact that problematic, unproblematic is far too simple a binary for assessing the morality of a text. Art is rarely so straightforward. A great many films are more fraught, demonstrating some flawed thinking or regressive attitude while simultaneously pushing towards a progressive or virtuous end. And no film embodies this complexity more fully than The Searchers. Directed in 1956 by John Ford, The Searchers follows Ethan Edwards, a former Confederate soldier who embarks on a revenge mission after his brother's family are slaughtered by Comanche warriors, and his youngest niece Debbie taken captive. That premise suggests a traditional tale of cowboys versus Indians. The Comanche are the boogeyman on the frontier, attacking an innocent white family without cause and led by a stoic, merciless chief whose one-dimensional villainy is reflected in the almost comically evil name of Scar. Scar is also played by a white actor in Redface. The only indigenous actor with a name role is Beulah Archuleta as Look, a comic relief character who exists to be mocked and abused for the amusement of a white audience. Needless to say, the film's portrait of indigenous people is extremely insensitive. At the same time, however, Ford is quite critical of his protagonist. Ethan's violence against the Comanche is not merely motivated by justice or even vengeance, but a deep-rooted racial hatred and a pathological need to annihilate indigenous people. This is a man who comes across a herd of buffalo and slaughters as many as he can so that there's less food to fill Indian bellies. This is a man who shoots the eyes out of a Comanche corpse because of a spiritual belief that a Comanche without eyes cannot enter their spiritual land and is doomed to wander in purgatory. Ethan doesn't even believe this, but he'll still defile a corpse if it means causing more pain and making a mockery of Comanche culture. This is a man whose mission is not to save Debbie, but to kill her because she's been contaminated by Indian blood. Ethan wants no less than the obliteration of the Comanche, and his methods and motivations mirror the historical violence committed against indigenous people, from the slaughter of buffalo as a means to starve and conquer Plains Indians to the fear of race mixing which underlines Ethan's mission. Crucially, The Searchers observes this racism from a distance. Ethan may be the protagonist, but the film's moral center is Martin, a young man who joins Ethan's quest and consistently challenges his elders' violence. The presence of a more tempered, more moderate voice positions Ethan as an extremist, and as much tension comes from this ideological clash as from the search itself. Ethan seemingly wins that clash when he reveals that it was Scar who murdered Martin's mother many years ago. You might expect this to be the moment where the naive youth becomes hardened, embracing the necessity of destroying the uncaring enemy who has wronged him.
I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say kill them all! Yeah! Okay!
But Martin holds true to his principles.
But that don't change it. That don't change nothing.
The violence committed against Martin does not justify more slaughter. Rather than just being a racist movie, The Searchers is a movie about racist hatred, about a man who overcomes it, and another who cannot. Even the film's racist elements have layers. Scar seems like a one-dimensional villain who attacks the Edwards family without motivation, but when we finally meet the man, we learn his own sons have been killed by white men, and by implication, that his own home has endured the attacks of white settlers. The Cowboys vs. Indians story is not such a simple tale of good and evil. The comedy with Look is very uncomfortable, all the more so because moral center Martin is as awful to her as Ethan is. But the men's cruelty is also responsible for driving her into the wilderness, where she is killed by the US cavalry in a raid on an Indian village. They are complicit in her death, and so too is the audience, for carelessly laughing along to her abuse. Speaking of comedy, the homestead scenes with Martin's lover Lori stand out as being far goofier than the rest of the movie. On one level, these scenes offer comedic relief to the increasingly dark main story, a necessary reprieve in commercial entertainment. The scenes also reinforce the divide between the innocence of the homestead and the violence of the frontier, a divide crucial to the film's iconic final shot, where there is no place for Ethan in the home, and he is doomed to wander, not unlike the Comanche whose eyes he'd shot out. But when Martin finally returns home, Lori launches into a racist tirade, agreeing with Ethan that Debbie has been tainted by savage blood and endorsing his plan to kill her. It is a shocking moment which completely dismantles her seemingly innocent facade. The gentleness of white femininity masks a bigotry no less vile than Ethan's. Quick editor's note, it's also telling that while Lori is hurt when she learns Martin accidentally married another woman, she only grows angry when she learns the woman is indigenous. The frontier and homestead may be separate, but they are built atop the same violence. There might not be room for Ethan's overt racism in the home, or the broader American society, to develop through the West, but that home and that society are made possible through indigenous slaughter, and when pushed, they embrace the same core beliefs. If you dismiss The Searchers as just another old racist Western, then you've barely scratched the surface. For all the film's flaws, and there are many, it is also an ambitious attempt to grapple with the historical roots of racism and white supremacy. Those themes are there for an audience willing to put in the work. But that's the rub, isn't it? Old movies are work. And I don't mean because of ideology or political correctness. I mean because of film language. In the same way that high schoolers struggle with Shakespeare because we don't talk like that, the evolution of film language makes for a challenge to modern viewers without a historical context. The sensibilities for film acting, realism, and pacing have changed so much since the 1950s that even a basic engagement with the material is difficult. I have seen The Searchers with first-year undergrads many times, and without fail, the audience laughs at this moment of horrific realization and violence. The dramatic zoom and the wide-eyed performance read to them as quaint, and the violence is so shocking they don't know how to handle it, so they laugh. That's not to say the film's dated aesthetics are bad, because they're definitely not. The Searchers is beautifully made, with some exquisite imagery and an utterly compelling lead performance from John Wayne, the best of his career. The pacing may feel slow when compared to the cutting of modern Hollywood, but that restrained tempo is perfectly suited to the film's dark journey into the heart of racial hatred. But adjusting to these rhythms, and to the rhythms of classic cinema more broadly, takes work. Dismissing old movies as problematic is an effective way to dodge that work. If old movies are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist, then you don't have to make the effort to adjust to a new film language. You can even reframe a refusal to engage with old movies as a moral victory, an indicator of personal righteousness. This is a mistake. We've already cited examples of old movies which do espouse progressive values, for one, but ignoring history also leads to vast misconceptions, especially as films are viewed outside of their context. Cowboys vs. Indians is a long-standing trope in westerns, but one that has fallen out of favor in modern iterations of the genre. As America has slowly reckoned with its history of colonialism, the western has shifted away from Indian villains, or even featuring indigenous characters at all. When indigenous people do appear in contemporary westerns, they are largely depicted sympathetically, which has been a growing trend since the 1970s. And when it comes to classic westerns, far more young people are exposed to Sergio Leone than John Ford, the former spaghetti westerns sidestepping Native American characters and conflicts almost entirely. Consequently, most young viewers don't have context for what Cowboys vs. Indians in westerns actually looks like. And if they watch The Searchers, either because of its canon status or because they're shown it in a classroom, they're liable to see the film as representative of how old Hollywood depicted the conflict. But it isn't. Most old westerns don't acknowledge their racism. The dehumanizing of indigenous people is casual and passive. The films are uncritical of their racist attitudes because they don't see them as being worth interrogating. Ford's own Stagecoach is a good example. The Apache are just an obstacle for the film's heroes. Narratively, it doesn't matter what tribe they are, or even that they're indigenous. They could just as easily have been bandits, or renegade soldiers, or even zombies. The film just needs a threat to attack the eponymous stagecoach. The focus is on the characters, the adventure, and the romance, not the racial violence that is so core to The Searchers. It's also a mistake to assume every old Western movie portrayed Indians as the bad guys. Many Westerns are passively racist, but there are those which offered a more sympathetic depiction. 1950's Broken Arrow is significantly about brokering peace between whites and the Apache, rather than waging war. 1948's Fort Apache is about conflict between the Apache and the US cavalry, but the instigator is not an Apache attack. It's Colonel Owen Thursday, a Custer-inspired military man who leads his troops in a suicide mission which dooms any possibility of peace. The film's director is again John Ford, whose depictions of white society's violence against indigenous people go as far back as the silent era. Three Bad Men begins with the Dakota land rush, where white settlers flocked to seize the land. And among the film's earliest images are the Sioux people who are being displaced in the process. The film explicitly links this displacement to the greed of settlers who hunger for the gold in the ground. Keep in mind, Three Bad Men was made over a decade before Stagecoach launched a run of far more famous and acclaimed sound westerns. And already, Ford is wrestling with America's history of colonialism, how what was the American dream for some was a nightmare for others. None of these films are perfect. Many feature red-facing, indulge in stereotypes, and all privilege a white point of view, but they illustrate the complexity of indigenous representation in the old Hollywood Western. and provide the necessary historical context for the searchers, neither a microcosm of the genre's commonplace racism, nor its critical stance a complete aberration. And historical context goes beyond just the films, and also includes reception. There's a kind of historical narcissism that can emerge when engaging with the problematic media of the past. The present-day viewer staring in disbelief asking, how is this ever okay? When it often wasn't okay. Like the continuously regurgitated sentiment that you couldn't make a Mel Brooks movie today, ignoring that Brooks' films were frequently met with controversy and criticism, a lot of the movies which seem problematic by modern standards were also controversial in their own time. The Birth of a Nation may have been more widely acclaimed 100 years ago, but it has always been protested. Gone with the Wind drew headlines a few years ago when it was pulled from HBO Max in the wake of the George Floyd protests, but black artists and activists have been taking the film's racism to task since 1939. I frequently criticized the Sidney Poitier star persona for its lack of complexity and for pandering to white sensibilities, but these criticisms are not the least bit new. Many black intellectuals articulated the same critique with greater depth and force in the 1960s. Film history is evidently more complex than black and white morality, but that doesn't get around the fact that many old films do embrace offensive ideas. Sometimes old movies are more complicated than appearances suggest, but sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and an old offensive movie is just offensive. But that doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. I joked earlier about loving James Bond despite the franchise's litany of problematic elements, but it's not really a joke. I do love these movies. I'm certainly not blind to the series' faults. Bond's depiction as sex pest and his entitlement to women's bodies, the embrace of colonialist rule, the many racist stereotypes, the flattering portrayal of Margaret Thatcher, these are all gross, but none of them ruin the series' many artistic triumphs, at least for me. I can acknowledge the problematic while still loving the beautiful music, both the film scores and theme songs, the elaborate production design, exciting stunt work, and the rousing escapism the films provide. It's also a question, though, of how present the problematic elements are within a film. Misogyny runs through the series, but I'm more willing to tolerate the casual sexism in movies like Dr. No or From Russia with Love in a way that I can't with the acted upon violence in Goldfinger. It's not that the former is okay, but the latter is far more egregious and upsetting. Likewise, how essential is the offensive material to the overall film? There's an abhorrently racist gag in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where the ethnically diverse women at Blofeld's Institute are each fed a meal reflecting their national cuisine, the punchline being, this shot of a black woman eating a banana. I won't mince words here. This is disgusting, and I so wish it wasn't in the movie. But it's also one gag in a 2-hour and 20-minute film. It does not dominate screen time, nor is it integral to the plot, characters, or themes. This is of course highly subjective. I'm able to stomach this gag, for someone else it might ruin the movie. That's completely fair. I will also acknowledge my own privilege here. It's easier for me, as a white man, to let the racism go because I'm not the target of the joke. Pleasure beyond this moment is also an important factor. I love most everything On Her Majesty's Secret Service is doing. The sudden racism is an unpleasant interruption to that enjoyment. But if another viewer is already unimpressed by the film, is already not enjoying themselves, the racism further sours that experience. There's little motivation then to forgive the film's bigotry. But bigotry in comedy can also be a complex topic. Don't get me wrong, the Majesty gag is pretty unambiguously racist and deplorable. But what about the homophobic jokes I alluded to earlier from The Hangover and The 40-Year-Old Virgin? Are these punchlines a mockery of gay people, or are they a mockery of the straight characters saying homophobic things? The context of the gay jokes in this scene from The 40-Year-Old Virgin is that these are the guys protagonist Andy is looking to as a guide for understanding women, and they're clearly morons who shouldn't be taken seriously in that capacity. The Hangover is even more explicit. Paging Dr. Fsler is a punchline to a setup where Stu insists to his wife that his friends are actually mature and good and she doesn't need to worry about their behavior at the bachelor party. Both of these scenes derive humor from the immaturity of the dude bro characters. But is an audience of dude bros going to pick up on this criticism? Especially in movies which overall see these characters as lovable and fun guys. And does that layer of comedy justify invoking such homophobic stereotypes and slurs? The answer is going to depend on the viewer, both their own emotional response to the jokes and how charitably they interpret the intent of the filmmakers. Do you think the joke is that Andy shouldn't believe what these idiots say about gender and seduction, or that it's funny to call Coldplay gay? Is the joke how immature Stu's friends are, or that one of them said a slur? To that end, it's important to consider a film's tone and framing. I criticized the politics of Dirty Harry in a previous video, namely the film's thesis that cops should have complete authority to do whatever they want, and the rights of citizens only impede justice and thus can be violated if necessary. But you could argue most cop movies do this to some extent, especially action movies which need to facilitate drama and excitement. What makes Dirty Harry so significant is how it foregrounds these beliefs. Harry Callahan's abuses of power are not just the dramatic conceit, but an articulated political position. The film devotes entire scenes for Harry to tear down the bureaucratic weenies who defend the rights of citizens, straw men easily humiliated by our logical and badass hero.
It's the law. Well, then the law is crazy.
The limits placed on police power are explicitly linked to Scorpio's killing spree, and it's only by rejecting and rising above the law that Harry is able to defeat the villain. Coupled with the film's gritty visual style and ripped from the headline's plot, it's clear the film is offering political commentary. Dirty Harry's ideology is as integral to the film as its protagonist or its action scenes. Compare all that to The Untouchables.
You carry a badge?
Yes?
Carry a gun.
Like Dirty Harry, the film's position is that criminals are so dangerous, sadistic, and evil that cops need to act without restraint or regulation, including being able to murder suspects without consequence.
He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
Taken literally, that's terrifying. But the film's tone is pure pulp. The period setting, archetypical characters, over-the-top villain, and Ennio Morricone's romantic score reject realism and embrace fantasy. Like, look how silly this is. Despite being loosely based on history, The Untouchables is not trying to be real, nor to offer commentary on how policing should operate in the real world. It's trying to be a comic book battle between good and evil, and a playground for Brian De Palma to cut loose with indulgent set pieces. That doesn't make its politics any less reactionary than Dirty Harry's, or that they shouldn't be studied, but it does mean they hit differently. And that also doesn't make Dirty Harry bad. Don Siegel's direction is lean and precise, effectively conveying Scorpio's sadism and Harry's hateful obsession. The action is exciting, yet grounded, brutally simplistic. And Clint Eastwood's temperament is perfectly suited to Harry Callahan, casually cool, capable, and wholly convincing as both action hero and authoritative cop. Its politics are a barrier for me that caps my enjoyment, but the film is still exceptionally well made. So, what do? How do we deal with old movies? The stock answer is to simply judge art in the context of its own time, without bringing in modern sensibilities. That seems reasonable, but it isn't very practical. For one, we've already demonstrated that many movies were not simply okay for the time, but even if they were, that time is gone. The past may be a foreign country, with its own customs and values, but we in the present can never fully visit that country, especially those of us who were never there in the first place. Just as old films cannot fully be removed from the historical contexts which produced them, neither can the contemporary viewer be removed from the present moment which produces them. We will always bring in the baggage of now, and that's largely a good thing. Retrospective analysis creates better understanding of the work, the culture, and the viewer themselves. A movie doesn't need to be ideologically pure to be good, but that doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye to ideological shortcomings. Hirsch advocates for an open-minded viewer, and openness is not incompatible with criticism. Face up to the failings in classic cinema, but continue to engage. Don't shut down or write off movies when you encounter the problematic. Dig deeper. This video has largely addressed the hypothetical young filmgoer, lacking historical context, but there is also responsibility for the curators, be they authors, professors, viewing outlets like streaming or TV channels, even humble YouTubers, to provide that context, to give the necessary tools to the young filmgoer for how to watch and think through old movies. There's a lot of pushback to the use of content warnings or trigger warnings, ranging from sensible debate of their efficacy to reactionary anger to their very presence. But in flagging potentially harmful material in advance, they serve an important purpose. Contrary to popular belief, these warnings are not strictly to allow the audience to avoid triggering material, but to adequately prepare audiences so they are not blindsided by its presence. A viewer who is given a content warning for a film's problematic elements is better equipped, not only to recognize the artistry alongside the problematic, but to think more critically about the latter. Content warnings provide a context that fosters better, more productive engagement. We shouldn't elide the problematic aspects of old movies, even the old movies we love, but be upfront about them. And that is happening. Content warnings, though not universally accepted, are a common part of the classroom, and hosts on places like TCM have become increasingly open about the moral failings of their classic programming. Even streaming services have been known to include disclaimers for cultural insensitivity. These are worthwhile efforts, though I do think more can be done. The disclaimer method in particular strikes me as a bare minimum that can sometimes calcify thinking rather than open it up. Labeling a film with a single sentence acknowledgement of problematic material reduces the work to its worst elements, and that can be constricting. A descriptor which introduces the searchers as a racist movie with insensitive cultural portrayals, though not strictly inaccurate, prescribes a limited vantage point for engaging with the film. More detailed context, in the form of essays or introductions, or discussions that have more space to weigh the nuance and complexity of a work, are a lot more beneficial. Still, I'll take any strides toward bringing old movies into the present rather than leaving them in the past. Because old movies are important, but this isn't just about dealing with old movies. It's about dealing with new ones too. 2023 was a great year for cinema, and particularly for challenging cinema that stirred ethical debate. Does Oppenheimer's refusal to show the Japanese victims of the atomic bomb erase the violence committed against them? Is The Zone of Interest's detached observation of a Nazi family just an art house-flavored exploitation of the Holocaust? Do May December's camp elements trivialize child abuse? I'm not here to settle these questions, but they do indicate that working through difficult media is an ongoing effort. Engaging with old movies is not just beneficial for its own sake, but for developing media literacy, for building the skills to parse what a film depicts and the intent and ideology of the filmmakers. The fraught, the challenging, and yes, the problematic are not consigned to the past, but grappling with that past helps us grapple with our present. How do we deal with old movies? We need to watch them. We need to actually watch them.